Everyone thought the cowboy's little girl was just getting sick, until her stomach kept growing in a way no child's body should. By the time the housekeeper arrived, the truth was already too dangerous to ignore. Ruth Bell came to Mercer Ranch expecting hard work, not a silent crisis hiding behind a child's forced smile. 7-year-old Ellie wore thick layers even in heat, flinched at every step, and refused to eat. But what terrified Ruth wasn't the pain. It was how desperately the girl tried to hide it. When Ruth finally uncovered what was tied beneath those clothes, she realized this wasn't illness. It was something growing, something worsening every day. And if no one acted fast, the child wouldn't survive. The freight wagon rolled away before the dust settled. Ruth Bell stood beside her trunk and watched it go. The driver did not look back. He had taken her as far as Dry Creek Crossing, and that was all he meant to do. Beyond that point, the ranch road turned stony and narrow. He wanted no part of it. A gust pushed grit against her skirt. She set one broad hand on the trunk lid to steady it. In her pocket was a folded county letter with a neat stamp on the front. Widow labor placement. Mercer Ranch. Housekeeper wanted. Terms fair. It was not charity, and Ruth had held to that line ever since the letter reached her boarding room 3 towns away. But letters did not lift trunks. Letters did not give beds. Letters did not make people kinder when they looked at a woman built like Ruth Bell. Dry Creek was a short street of weathered fronts, a hitch rail, a feed store, a smithy, and one hotel with peeling paint around the door. Men passed her and looked once too long, not from surprise, but from the quick measuring people do when they think a stranger may become a burden. Ruth did not ask any of them for help. She bent, caught the handle of her trunk with both hands, and dragged it across the rutted street toward the hotel porch. By the time she reached the steps, sweat had gathered under her collar. She stopped there, breathing hard, and read the hand-painted sign beside the door. No rooms advanced, pay first. Inside, the clerk sat behind a scarred desk with a spoon in his tea. He looked at Ruth, then at the trunk through the open doorway. "I need one night," Ruth said. "I've got work papers for Mercer Ranch. Their man may be in town before dark." The clerk took the paper, read just enough to know it was real, and laid it back down. No rooms left. Ruth glanced toward the wall rack. 4 keys hung there. He saw her see them, reserved. For who? He shrugged, for folks paying. She held his eyes a second. "I can pay at dawn when Mercer settles me." "That ain't paying now." He slid the paper back across the desk with one finger, as if even touching it should be brief. Ruth took it, turned, and walked out before the silence in the room could get any meaner. The sun had shifted west when she heard the small sound by the hitch rail. Not a cry, not a call, just a hard breath pulled through pain. A little girl stood near the feed store post with both arms locked over her middle. Her dress was clean but old. Over it she wore a quilted riding apron too thick for the weather. One knee bent inward as if standing straight hurt. She looked 7, maybe a little more. Too young to carry that kind of strain in her face. Ruth had not met her, but she knew at once who she must be. Ellie Mercer. The girl tried to straighten. She almost managed it. Then the pain caught again and her shoulders folded. Ruth stepped off the boardwalk. "You need to sit down." Ellie jerked her head up. Fear came first, then shame. The child pressed even harder across her stomach, like the worst part of the hurt might show if her hands slipped. Before Ruth could move closer, a wagon rolled up fast from the far end of the street. Wade Mercer climbed down before the horses had fully stopped. He crossed to Ellie in 3 quick strides and crouched in front of her. He did not fuss. He did not waste words. "Since when?" he asked. Ellie kept her eyes lowered. "Just now." Wade slid one hand behind her back. "That's not what I asked." She swallowed. "Since the store." He nodded once, already angry at himself for not seeing it sooner. Then he lifted her carefully. The child settled against him and pressed her face into his shoulder. One hand stayed trapped between them, hard against her own belly. Ruth saw then what the thick apron had hidden. The child's middle pushed out wrong on one side. Not round, not even. A hard shape under cloth where no child's body should hold one. Wade turned toward the feed store and noticed Ruth standing there. His eyes dropped to the county paper still in her hand. Something in his face changed. Not warmth, recognition. "You Ruth Bell?" "Yes." He shifted Ellie higher against his chest. "I sent for a housekeeper." Ruth looked from him to the wagon. "Your road starts badly." "That's why I sent for someone who can stay on her feet." It might have sounded rude from another man. From him it sounded like a condition stated plain. Ruth nodded. "I stay on them." A horse snorted behind them. Wade glanced back toward the supply sacks still in the wagon bed. "I've got business yet," he said. "If you can wait till sundown, I'll take you out." He started to turn away, then stopped and looked at her trunk in the dust. Without another word, he walked over, took one handle in his free hand, and hauled it to the wagon. He did it one-handed while holding his daughter with the other arm. That alone told Ruth more about the man than any speech could have done. He set the trunk aboard, covered it with a tarp, and tied it off tight. "You eaten?" he asked. "Kid," Ruth said, "not since morning." He reached into the feed sack tied behind the seat, pulled out half a cold biscuit wrapped in cloth, and handed it to her. It was not enough for a meal. It was enough to say he had seen the problem and did not mean to name it aloud. Ruth took it. "Thank you." He gave one nod, then carried Ellie into the feed store office where the shade was better. Ruth stayed by the wagon a moment, the biscuit warm from the cloth. She did not eat it yet. She watched the office window instead. Inside, Wade sat Ellie on a chair and bent near her, speaking low. The child answered once, then shook her head and looked away. He was careful with her, careful in the way of a man who had been afraid for too long and had run out of soft talk. The hotel clerk came out onto his porch and stared across the street. "You waiting on Mercer?" he called. "Yes." "He keeps to himself." "That suits me." The clerk gave a dry laugh and went back inside. Ruth sat on the edge of the wagon tongue until shadows lengthened across the road. Twice Ellie came out and walked a little slow and stiff. Twice Wade noticed before she called him. He never left her far from his sight. Toward sundown, a town deputy stopped at the hitch rail and said something low to Wade. Ruth saw the cowboy's face go hard in a quiet way. He answered without raising his voice. The deputy tipped his hat and moved on. When Wade came back, he checked Ellie's face, then Ruth's trunk rope. "We leave now," he said. Ruth climbed onto the rear board. Ellie sat beside her father on the front seat, shoulders straight by effort more than comfort. The wagon rolled out of Dry Creek. They had not gone half a mile before Ellie sucked in a breath and folded over again. This time Wade pulled the team up so fast the wagon rocked. He turned toward her, one hand already reaching. Ruth leaned forward and saw the child's apron had ridden up. Under the thin dress, something firm stood out along the left side of her lower belly. Not a child's full stomach, not wind, not anything ordinary. Ellie dragged the apron down with shaking hands. She looked at Ruth once, just once, and the fear in her face was worse than the pain. Ruth sat back slowly. The county letter in her pocket no longer felt like work papers. It felt like a door she had stepped through without knowing what waited behind it. They did not reach the ranch that night. 2 miles out, one trace strap split on the near horse. Wade got down at once and checked the leather by fading light. He could knot it enough to limp the team another stretch, but not over the ridge road in darkness. "There's a line shed by Miller's Wash," he said. "We stopped there." Ellie made no complaint. That worried Ruth more than if the child had cried. The shed was little more than 3 plank walls, a lean roof, and an old iron stove that smoked when lit. Wade carried in a lantern, a blanket roll, and a small crate of supplies. Ruth brought her own bag and the flour sack. Ellie walked by herself, but one hand never left the thick apron at her waist. Inside, the room held one bunk, a rough bench, and a water pail with a dent in the side. Wade looked at the space and made his choices fast. "Ellie takes the bunk. You can have the bench or the floor by the stove. I'll stay outside with the team." Ruth said, "Bench is fine." He shook his head. "You're hired to work, not freeze." He spread a bedroll on the floor near the stove and set another blanket on top of it. Ruth did not thank him twice. Men like Wade Mercer did not know what to do with too much gratitude. Ellie sat on the bunk while he loosened her boots. The girl's face had gone dull with tiredness, but every time he reached near the apron ties, she flinched and turned away. Wade noticed. He said nothing. That silence stayed in the room after he stepped outside. Ruth knelt by the stove, got a weak flame going, and warmed a cup of water. She broke the biscuit Wade had given her and softened half in the cup. Then she looked at Ellie. "Small bites," she said. Ellie stared at the cup. "I'm not hungry." Ruth did not argue. She set it within reach and turned to hang her shawl by the stove hook. 5 minutes later, the cup was empty. That told her enough. Later, when the lantern burned low, Ruth heard the bunk rope creak. She kept still and watched from half-closed eyes. Ellie sat up slowly, looked toward the door to make sure her father was outside, then slid one hand under the apron and pulled the ties tighter. Not to hold a blanket, not to keep warm. To press something down. The child bit her lip while she did it. When she lay back, she was breathing shallow and fast. Ruth turned her face toward the wall before Ellie could catch her watching. At dawn, Wade led the horse team to water and fixed the strap with rawhide from his repair kit. While he worked, Ruth stepped outside with the wash pan. The country around them was bare and wide. Low scrub, dry creek bed, a line of cottonwoods further east, nothing moved except light across the ridge. Ellie came out a few minutes later and sat on the step. Without the apron tied tight, the shape beneath her dress showed more clearly. The swelling sat low and to one side, and the skin above it looked stretched even through cloth. Ruth rinsed the pan and kept her voice light. "That thing too tight on you." Ellie's eyes went straight to the apron in her lap. "It keeps me straight." "Who told you that?" The child gave the sort of answer children give when they mean to stop a door before it opens. "It just does." Ruth dried the pan with a corner of cloth. "Hurts when you eat." Ellie looked up fast, then her face closed. Before either of them could say more, Wade came around the shed with the trace strap in hand. Ellie snatched up the apron and tied it at once. He saw the speed of it. He saw Ruth see it too. Still he said only, "We roll in 10 minutes." By mid-morning, they reached the ridge road above Mercer land. The ranch spread below in pieces. The main house, a long barn, a small smokehouse, a chicken run leaning sideways, and beyond it a pasture fenced more by repair than by good lumber. It was not poor, it was overworked. Wade drove them into the yard and stopped at the trough. A ranch dog came from under the porch, sniffed Ruth's skirt, and lay back down. No bark. That meant the house had been lonely enough to welcome any new smell. Inside, the kitchen was in order but tired. Clean plates, dried mud by the door, a mend basket left half done on a chair. Someone had kept things from falling apart. No one had given them ease. Wade brought Ruth her terms plain, while Ellie disappeared down the hall. $6 the month, room off the pantry, meals here. Sundays are yours unless there's sickness or weather. Ruth nodded, and the child. He looked toward the hall. What about her? If she's ill, I need to know what I'm walking into. His face shut at once. You're here to keep house. Ruth met his gaze. A house with a sick child is not just a house. For a moment, she thought he might send her back with the wagon still unhitched. Instead, he took off his hat and set it on the table with careful hands. Doctor in Dry Creek says she's troubled in the gut. Comes and goes. He left powders, said she'd outgrow it. Ruth asked, do you believe that? Wade looked toward the hall again. I believe she hurts. That was the truest thing he had said. Ellie reappeared in the doorway with her coat back on over the apron, though the kitchen was warm. She had washed her face. She had also learned to arrange herself so the left side of her dress stayed turned away. Wade reached for the stew pot. Ellie said too quickly, I don't want any. He paused. You didn't eat much at the shed. I'm not hungry. The same words, the same false flatness. Ruth moved to the shelf, took down a small bowl, and ladled only 2 spoonfuls into it. She set it before the girl and sat across from her without speaking. Ellie looked at the bowl as if it had accused her of something. At last she took one bite, then another. On the third, her face changed. She set the spoon down very carefully, too carefully. Wade noticed at once, Ellie. The girl slid off the chair and walked toward the back door. She made it to the threshold before her body folded in half. The bowl shattered on the floor behind her. Wade was there first, dropping to one knee beside her. Ruth was next with a towel. Ellie did not cry. She only held her middle with both arms and shook with the effort of staying quiet. Ruth saw then that this was no passing stomach trouble. The pain had rules. It came after food. It sharpened with motion. And the child feared the seeing of it almost as much as the hurt itself. Wade lifted Ellie without a word and carried her down the hall. At the bedroom door, he stopped and looked back at Ruth. Not asking for help, not yet. But he did not tell her to stay out either. That was the first place Mercy entered the house. Small, strained, and late, but there. Ruth began work before the house had decided whether to trust her. She swept the kitchen, set bread to rise, aired the pantry, and washed the bedding from the lined shed. Wade moved through his chores with the caution of a man listening for one room even while he stood in another. Twice he went to Ellie's door and came back without waking her. By noon, the child rose on her own and came into the kitchen washed and dressed, the quilted apron hidden beneath a fresh pinafore. Ruth noticed the extra stiffness in the way she sat. She said nothing. The day might have gone quietly if the supply wagon had not failed to arrive. Wade had been expecting lamp oil, oats, and a crate of canned peaches Ellie could usually keep down. When the road stayed empty past noon, he swore under his breath and checked the sky. Road washed out by Miller's wash, he guessed, or a wheel gone. He did not like uncertainty. Ruth saw that at once. By mid-afternoon, he made his choice. I'm riding to the line shed. If the freight got stuck there, I'll bring it in before dark. Ellie straightened too fast. I'm coming. You're not. I am. The argument was short because it was old. Wade tried refusal first. Ellie answered with silence so stiff it meant she would wait by the yard gate until dark if he left her behind. At last, he rubbed a hand over his face and gave in. You ride wrapped and you tell me the minute it starts. She nodded with too much relief. Ruth packed a tin of crackers, a water bottle, and the folded shawl from her room. She handed the shawl to Wade. For the wagon seat, she said, less jolt. He took it. We won't be long. They were gone 3 hours. The shadows had turned long by the time the wagon came back into the yard. Ruth heard the wheels first, then Wade's voice, low and urgent. She stepped onto the porch and saw at once something had gone wrong. The supply crates were in the wagon bed, but Ellie was half lying against the seat, one arm across her stomach, face white as dishwater. Wade had the reins in one hand and the shawl gathered beneath the child with the other to soften the jolts. What happened? Ruth called. Freight broke an axle near the wash, he said. We had to shift the load by hand. That explained the crates, not the look on Ellie's face. When the wagon stopped, Wade climbed down and reached up for her. The moment he touched her side, she sucked in a hard breath and bit it off. Ruth saw the apron edge under the pinafore. It had cut deep enough to leave a line through the cloth itself. Inside, Ruth said. Wade carried Ellie to the settee near the stove. The child tried to curl inward. She could not bend far enough. Ruth knelt and untied the girl's boots. Crackers. Ellie shook her head. Water. A small nod. She took only a sip, then another. After the second, she pressed the heel of her hand against the left side of her lower belly and held still. Wade set the crate of peaches on the table harder than he meant to. Glass rattled inside. At the shed she walked fine, he said. Soon as we loaded the last crate, she went white. I told you not to come. Ellie did not answer him. That frightened him more. Ruth looked up. Leave the blame alone. Help me with the shawl. He did. Together they eased Ellie flat along the settee, a folded blanket under her knees. The position took some strain off her middle. Her breathing slowed a little. Ruth saw Wade watching the child's face with a helpless fury he had likely been swallowing for months. He could mend leather, fence a pasture, bring in supplies in the dark. None of that reached what was wrong here. She keeps it tighter when she rides, Ruth said quietly. Wade frowned. What? The apron, or whatever she's using under it. She tightens it before a wagon trip. He looked at Ellie. Why? The girl turned her face toward the wall. Ruth answered for her. Because she thinks if it doesn't show, it can't get worse. Silence sat heavy between them. Wade stepped back from the settee and braced both hands on the table edge. It was the first time Ruth had seen him stand not like a cowboy or a father, but like a man losing ground inch by inch. Dry Creek doctor never said a word about binding, he muttered. Did he undress her to look? Wade did not answer quickly. That told Ruth enough. Night came on while Ellie dozed in short, broken stretches. Ruth made thin broth and left it by the stove in case the girl woke easier. Wade went out to unharness the team and stayed longer than the chore required. When he returned, he carried a small wooden box from the back room. He set it on the table but did not open it. "My wife kept medical things in here," he said. "Bandages, salves, notes." Ruth looked at the box, then at him. "Notes from who?" "Her mother before she took sick." The words changed the air in the room. Not because Ruth had not known another woman had once governed this house. She had seen the traces of her everywhere, but notes meant instructions. Instruction. S meant someone had already been trying to manage this long before Ruth came. Wade rested one hand on the lid and then removed it. "I haven't touched most of it since she died," he said. "Ellie did. I found the box moved once or twice, thought she wanted to feel close to her." Ruth looked toward the settee, where the girl slept with one hand curled over the hidden swelling. Maybe that was why. Maybe not. Either way, the road to the truth had just widened. The house settled after dark, but Ruth did not sleep. Wade had taken the medical box to the kitchen table and left it closed. Twice he stood over it. Twice he walked away. At last he went to check the barn and said he would return before midnight. Ruth waited until his boots faded from the yard. Then she opened the box. Inside lay rolled bandages, a chipped spoon, 2 small tonic bottles, a packet of dried mint tied with thread, and 3 folded sheets of paper in a woman's hand. The writing was neat at first, then less steady toward the end. Ruth did not read every line. She read enough to catch the drift. "When the swelling rises, keep pressure on it. Do not let her run. Warm broth only. If she cries, tighten the support and wait." No date, no doctor's signature, no proof the advice was sound. Just a dead woman's fear written into instructions. Ruth folded the pages back the way she found them. Her jaw tightened. A grieving mother could mistake harm for help. A grieving child could turn those mistakes into rules. On the settee, Ellie stirred. Ruth crossed the room and crouched beside her. The lantern light showed sweat at the girl's temples and strain in the corners of her mouth. She was half asleep and still guarding her middle. "Ellie," Ruth said softly, "wake enough to answer me." The girl opened her eyes. "That thing under your dress, did your mama tell you to wear it?" For a second, Ellie looked too surprised to lie. Then she swallowed and gave a small nod. "How long? Since spring. Every day." Another nod. "Did your pa know?" Ellie's fingers tightened on the blanket. "He knew Mama used cloth for the bad days. He didn't know I kept doing it." Ruth sat back on her heels. "Show me." Fear crossed the child's face so fast it was almost a tremor. "No." "You're hurting. It holds me in. It's bruising you." Tears came to Ellie's eyes, more from dread than pain. "If I don't tie it, I get bigger." There it was, the child's logic, small, frightened, and deadly. Ruth kept her voice even. "Listen to me, bigger is not the same thing as worse." Ellie shook her head. "The girls in town looked at me." Ruth felt a hard pull inside her chest. So someone had seen, someone had stared, maybe laughed, maybe only whispered. For a child, that was enough. She reached for the ties beneath the dress. Ellie caught her wrist. "Please." Ruth did not pry the hand away. "I'm not tearing it off, I'm looking." At last the girl let go. The apron under the dress was not a proper garment at all. It was a length of quilt batting stitched between old muslin strips, wound twice around the child's middle and pulled tight at the side. The edges had hardened with sweat and wear. Ruth loosened the first knot. Ellie gasped, not because it hurt to loosen, because she had held herself that way so long the idea of release frightened her. Ruth worked slowly, one tie, then the second, then the last. When the cloth fell open, the marks underneath made her go still. Deep grooves crossed Ellie's skin. The flesh above and below them had puffed up angrily. On the left side of the lower belly, beneath stretched skin, a hard, rounded rise sat fixed and unmistakable. Ruth laid 2 careful fingers near it. The mass did not shift. This was no child's bloating, no simple stoppage, no passing complaint the body would outgrow in summer. Ellie saw Ruth's face and began to shake. "Don't tell him." Ruth looked at her. "Why?" "He'll burn Mama's notes." The answer hit harder than she expected. For this child, the wrapping was not only concealment. It was loyalty. It was grief tied into cloth. The back door opened. Wade came in carrying cold air with him. He stopped at the sight before him. The loosened bands, the red grooves, Ruth beside the settee, Ellie crying in silence. For one sharp second, fear and guilt and anger all crossed his face together. Then he came forward. "What is that?" he asked, though the question was too late to carry much use. Ruth stood. "Something your wife believed would help." Wade looked at the open medical box, then at the notes on the table, and understood enough. Ellie tried to pull the cloth back over herself. Pain caught her halfway. She gagged and turned aside. Wade was beside her at once, one hand at her shoulder. Ruth caught the basin, but the child brought up almost nothing. There was too little in her stomach to throw up. That frightened Ruth nearly as much as the hard mass. "Get the lamp closer," she said. Wade did. Ruth placed her hand again near the rise, more gently this tea. Testing shape and edge. The thing sat low, firm, and anchored. Ellie flinched before Ruth even pressed. Wade saw it all. "Tell me plain," he said. Ruth looked up at him across the lamplight. "She needs a real doctor, not powders, not old notes, not guessing." His voice dropped. "What do you think it is?" "I think something inside her has been growing while the cloth kept trying to hide it." No one spoke after that. Ellie's small hand found the edge of her father's sleeve. Wade covered it with his own. He looked at the medical box as if it had turned traitor in his house. The room had changed. Until that night, pain had been a thing they managed, an ugly fact, a burden, something they hoped would pass if they kept the house running and the child quiet. Now it had shape. Now it had history. And by morning, it would need action. Ellie did not let go of Ruth's sleeve until morning. Even in sleep, her hand stayed twisted in the fabric as if Ruth might vanish if she loosened it. Ruth sat beside the narrow bed through the last dark hours, changing the basin water, cooling the child's face with a damp cloth, and marking each spell of pain by memory until dawn gave her enough light to write. When the room turned gray, she went to the kitchen, found a pencil stub near the flour crock, and pulled an old feed receipt from the shelf. She wrote 4 plain headings: food, pain, vomiting, swelling. Wade came in from the yard while she was bent over the table. He looked at the paper. "What's that for?" "A doctor who'll use his eyes." He stood there a moment, tired and unshaven, his hand still on the door latch. "Pike's been here before." Ruth did not look up. "Then Pike has already missed something." Wade said nothing after that. Through the morning, Ruth kept the notes simple. 2 spoonfuls of broth at first light, pain 20 minutes later. No fever at breakfast, swelling firmer on the left by midday. Ellie tried to hide the first signs out of habit, but now Ruth was watching for the shift in her face, the tightening around her mouth, the way her fingers drifted toward the bed cover before a stronger wave hit. There was no guesswork in it anymore. By late morning, Ellie had enough strength to sit up against the pillows. Ruth brought her the rag doll from the chair and threaded a needle through the loose arm seam. Ellie watched her work. "You pulled too hard." Ruth gave the doll a look. "Then it can forgive me." The child's mouth twitched. It was not quite a smile, but it was the nearest thing to one Ruth had seen since reaching the ranch. When Ruth handed the doll back, Ellie held it quiet against her ribs. After a while she asked, "Are you going away?" Ruth set the needle on the washstand. "Not today." That didn't answer me. "No," Ruth said, "it didn't." Ellie thought on that. Children notice the shape of truth even when adults try to soften it. At last the girl nodded once, as if the answer satisfied her simply because it had not been dressed up. Near noon, Wade went out to check the south fence where a post had gone loose in the night wind. Ruth used the quiet to change Ellie's dress and look again at the marks left by the binding. The skin had begun to rise in angry lines where the cloth had cut every day. Ellie stared past Ruth's shoulder at the wall. Her voice came small. "You can throw it away if you want." Ruth paused with the loosened strip in her hand. "Do you want me to?" The child swallowed. "No." Ruth understood then that the wrapping had become more than concealment. It was tied up with fear, yes, but also with memory. Some part of Ellie still believed letting go of it meant letting go of her mother, too. Ruth folded the cloth instead of tossing it. "Tell me about the girls," she said. Ellie's fingers tightened around the doll. "At school?" Ruth asked. A slow nod. "What did they say?" The answer took time. Then it came all at once, in a voice worn flat from repetition. "They watched me run, then they laughed. One said I was stuffed under my dress. One said I looked wrong. One said I kept my coat on because I was dirty." Ruth said nothing for a moment. The child had told the story enough times inside herself that it no longer came out with tears. That was the part that hurt most. "And that's when you started tying yourself down." Ellie nodded again. "Mama wrote that pressure helped on bad days." Ruth glanced toward the kitchen table where the medical box still sat closed. "Those notes were for pain, not for shame." Ellie looked down. "I didn't know the difference." Ruth folded the strip once more and set it aside. When Wade came back in, she met him in the hall. "She's been doing it since spring," Ruth said, "after girls in town started looking." Wade went still. Ruth kept her voice low, not to spare him, but because Ellie could hear every hard word through the half-open door. She thought flattening it would make the talk stop. He rubbed a hand across his mouth. "I kept her home because I thought the rides were tiring her. I never asked what happened there." Ruth answered, "You need to stop thinking in pieces. The pain and the hiding belong to the same thing now." That landed. Wade stood looking at the floorboards as if they might offer a simpler road. They did not. At last he said, "I'll fetch Pike." He rode out before dinner and brought the doctor back near dusk. Dr. Pike came into the house with road dust on his boots and impatience already in his face. He was the kind of man who had spent too many years being the only doctor in reach. It had taught him speed, but it had also taught him to mistake speed for judgment. He washed his hands in the basin, dried them on the towel by the stove, and entered Ellie's room without asking the child a single thing first. "How long has the swelling been worse?" he asked Wade. "Months," Wade said, but sharper lately. Pike glanced back. "You're only saying months now." Wade did not rise to it. "I'm saying it now because it is now." The doctor bent over the bed and pressed lightly on Ellie's lower belly. As she flinched at once, Ruth held out the paper from the kitchen. "Read this." Pike took it with poor grace. His eyes moved down the page once quickly, then a second time slower. He pressed again, deeper this time. Ellie cried out and turned her face into the pillow. "That's enough," Wade said. Pike drew back, but the look in his face had changed. He had felt the hard edge of something. He knew it too. The trouble was that knowing and naming are not the same thing, and weak men often choose the smaller act. He folded the paper once and handed it back. "What is it?" Wade asked. Pike reached for his bag. Could be bowel trouble, could be female trouble, hard to say. Ruth stared at him. "She is 7. He snapped the latch on his case. "Bodies don't ask our leave before turning difficult." That answer did not satisfy even him. Wade stepped closer. "You felt something." Pike kept his eyes on the bag. "I felt tenderness and swelling." "You felt more than that." The doctor lowered his voice, but he did not lower it enough. "If there has been mishandling in the house," he said, "that changes the kind of case this is." The room went cold. Ruth felt Ellie stop moving on the bed. Even if the child did not fully understand the words, she understood the stain in them. Wade took one step toward Pike. "Say that again," he said. Pike raised his hands a little. "I am not accusing. I am telling you what must be ruled out." Ruth moved between them before Wade's anger could make the scene worse. "No," she said. "You are hiding behind ugliness because you don't want to admit you don't know." Pike stiffened. "You're a housekeeper." "I'm the one who wrote down what you should have asked months ago." For the first time, he looked properly ashamed. Only for a second. Then the feeling hardened into defense. "I've advised caution," he said. "If concern exists, the sheriff will hear of it." Wade opened the front door himself. "Then hear this first," he said. "Get out." Pike left without another word. His boots crossed the porch, then the yard. A moment later, Ruth heard the pump handle outside stop moving. Someone had been at the water trough under the window. A ranch hand or a passing laborer. She did not need to see who. It did not matter. Half-heard talk travels faster than truth ever does. Behind her, Ellie's voice came from the bed. "What's female trouble?" No one answered at once. That silence told Ruth everything Pike had broken on his way out. By sunrise, the house had changed shape. The stove still needed wood. The chickens still scratched at the hard ground by the fence. Wade still saddled before breakfast because ranch work did not wait for grief or sickness. But something foul had entered with Pike and stayed after him. Ruth felt it before the first rider came through the yard. A man from the lower road stopped by the gate to return Wade's chain hook. He had no reason to come closer, yet he lingered there too long, hat in his hands, eyes sliding toward the house and away again. Wade went out to meet him. The exchange lasted less than a minute. When the rider left, the chain hook still hung over his saddle horn. Ruth saw Wade notice it too. The rumor had outrun the object it pretended to travel under. She took broth into Ellie's room and set the bowl on the washstand. The child sat propped against the pillows. pale from the bad night, her eyes older than they had any right to be. After a while she asked, what did he mean? Ruth sat on the bed edge. Dr. Pike. Ellie nodded. Ruth kept her voice steady. He meant he was talking about things he did not understand. About me. Yes. Ellie looked at the blanket in her lap. Because of my stomach. Ruth did not lie. Because people see something strange and turn stupid before they turn careful. The child's lower lip trembled. Pa didn't do anything. I know. I didn't either. I know that too. Ellie pressed both hands against her eyes. Then why do they think it? Ruth could have answered with the whole hard truth about towns and gossip and the way fear sticks to girls first. But that answer belonged to grown people, not children. Instead, she said, because some folks would rather guess than learn. That was when the knock came. 3 hard strikes, slow, official. Wade opened the front door. Sheriff Tom Baines stood there with dust on his coat hem and a look that said he already preferred the uglier version of the story. I need to ask some questions, he said. You can ask them here, Wade answered. Tom stepped past him anyway. His eyes moved over the room, then down the hall, then toward Ruth at the bedroom door. He had the habit of a man who wanted walls to confess on behalf of the people in them. I'll speak to the child, he said. No, Ruth answered. Both men turned toward her. Tom's expression hardened at once. This is sheriff's business. This is a sick room. He took 2 more steps. Ruth moved into the narrow hall and stopped there. She did not raise her voice. She simply made him choose whether he meant to shoulder through a woman to get at a frightened child. Tom saw the choice and disliked that she had made him see it. You're not in a position to bar me, he said. Then ask your questions where decent men can hear themselves asking them. Behind him, Wade said, very quiet, you ask me, or you leave. Tom understood then that he was close to showing too much of himself. Force works best in shadow. It looks meaner in kitchens. So he stepped back. All right, he said. Has the girl shown signs of abuse? The word fell heavy enough to reach the bedroom. Ruth heard the bed rope creak inside. Ellie had shrunk from the sound of it. Wade answered at once, no. Any hired men left alone with her? No. Any reason Dr. Pike would suggest misconduct? Ruth spoke before Wade could lose patience. Because Dr. Pike would rather stay in a house than admit ignorance. Tom ignored her. I asked the fathers. And I answered the man who came to trouble a child before breakfast. His eyes flashed. He did not like being named so plainly. For a moment, Ruth thought he might arrest someone just to restore himself. But he had no charge, only rumor, and rumor looks smaller when spoken out loud. He adjusted his vest and said to Wade, if you move the girl before I settle this, you'll answer for it. Then he left. The door shut behind him. Inside the bedroom, Ellie was breathing too fast. Ruth crossed to her at once, easy now. But the sheriff had done what the pain alone had not managed. He had turned Ellie against her own body again. They think I'm bad, the child whispered. No. They think Pa is bad. No. Her hands clamped over her ears. Make them stop. Ruth reached for her, but Ellie slid from the bed and ran. Not far, not fast. Pain bent her after the first few steps, but fear kept her moving through it. She crossed the kitchen, stumbled through the back door, and disappeared around the corner of the house before Wade could catch her. They searched the barn first, then the wash line, then the tack room. Nothing. Then Ruth saw the root cellar door standing open a hand's width. She took the lantern from the hook and went down. Ellie sat in the far corner beside the potato crates, knees drawn as close as the swelling allowed, her face hidden in both arms. She had made a little place for herself there, the sort of place a child builds when she believes hiding is the only control left. On the dirt beside her lay a cloth bundle. Ruth crouched down. "I'm not bringing the sheriff in here." Ellie did not look up. "I know." Ruth set the lantern on the step and opened the bundle slowly. Inside were the binding strips, 2 crushed mint sprigs, the pencil stub from the kitchen, and a flat piece of board scratched over with marks. Rows and rows of them. Some short, some heavy, some crossed in groups of 5. Ruth looked closer. "What are these?" Ellie wiped her nose on her sleeve. "Bad days." "You counted them." A small nod. "How long?" "Since the peach blossoms." Ruth went still. That meant months, more than anyone in the house had admitted aloud, more than Pike had earned the right to dismiss. She pointed to a few marks circled in clumsy pencil. "And these?" "Days I threw up." Ruth sat back on her heels and stared at the board. A 7-year-old child had been keeping record of her own suffering in secret, because the adults around her had never given it a name strong enough to trust. That was proof. Not gossip, not suspicion, proof. She looked inside the cloth again and found one more thing tucked under the strips, a folded scrap in the same hand as the notes from the medical box. "If the swelling shows, bind her before anyone sees." Ruth closed her fingers around the paper. There it was, the worst piece of it, not cruelty from the dead mother. Fear. Fear bad enough to be mistaken for instruction, then inherited by a child too young to challenge it. "Ellie," Ruth said carefully, "did your mama tell you to hide it from people?" Ellie shook her head. "She said folks stare, she wrote it down after." That fit what Ruth had seen in the box. A woman guessing her way through terror. A child turning those guesses into law. Ruth gathered the board, the cloth, and the note. Then she gathered Ellie, too. By the time they came back into the kitchen, Wade was waiting with his hands flat on the table, as if holding himself down there was the only way to stop from breaking something. Ruth laid the board in front of him. He read the marks slowly, then the circled ones, then the scrap of note. For a long time he said nothing. At last he pulled out a chair and sat hard in it. "She did this alone," he said. "Yes." He rubbed one hand over his eyes. When he lowered it again, the look on his face was no longer confusion, it was decision. "I'm taking her to the county clinic before sunrise." Ruth nodded. "Good." He looked up at her. "If Baines hears the wheels, he'll try to stop us." "Then we leave quiet." The rest of the day took on purpose. Ruth boiled cloth, packed bread, wrapped the notes and the scratch board in oilskin, and set aside Ellie's clean nightdress for the road. Wade checked the wagon, changed a wheel pin, and chose the strongest team. Neither of them wasted speech on fear. There was too much to do. That night, Ruth slept in the chair by Ellie's bed with her boots still on. Before dawn, Wade carried the child out under a sky still dark at the edges. Ruth climbed into the wagon beside them, the oilskin packet tucked under her shawl. The team had only just reached the ranch gate when a lantern swung into the road. Then another's. Sheriff Tom Baines stood in front of the horses with one deputy at his shoulder, and his free hand resting near his belt. "No farther," he said. Wade pulled the team up short. Ruth felt the whole road narrow to that single point. Tom lifted the lantern higher, so its light fell across Ellie's pale face under the blanket. "No child leaves this county," he said, "until I'm satisfied what happened in that house." For one hard second, Wade looked ready to drive straight through them. Ruth saw it in the reins. The deputy saw it too and took half a step back without meaning to. Tom Baines held his ground, but it was the stubbornness of a man who had mistaken control for authority and could no longer tell the difference. Ellie stirred between Ruth and Wade and made a sound too weak to be called a cry. "Move," Wade said. Tom lifted his chin. "Not until I ask more." "If you ask while she dies," Wade said, "you can answer for that." Tom ignored the words. He had come for the shape of a scandal, and he wanted it badly enough to stand in front of a sick child's wagon before dawn. Ruth looked past him at the empty road and understood the trap at once. If Wade forced the team through, Tom would own the story by sunrise. A father running from law with a child under blankets. That lie would travel faster than any truth they could catch after it. She put a hand on Wade's arm. He did not look at her. "No." "Listen." "I said no." So Ruth gave him the one thing sharp enough to cut through his anger. "If we fight him here, he keeps the dark." That made Wade turn. She met his eyes. "Take the town road, make him stop us where people can see what he's doing." Tom frowned. "What are you talking about?" Ruth did not give him the favor of answering. She held Wade's gaze instead. "Daylight," she said. "Witnesses, let the whole town choose what this is." For the first time that morning, Tom lost his footing inside the scene. He had planned to block a wagon in darkness, not defend himself in front of Main Street. Wade looked at Ellie, then back at Ruth. Then he snapped the reins sideways, turned the team in a hard arc, and drove for town. Tom shouted after them and wheeled his horse around, but he sounded smaller already. The road to Dry Creek shook the wagon hard. Ruth braced herself with one hand and held the blanket steady over Ellie with the other. The child's skin felt hot through the cloth. Twice she tried to retch. The second time brought almost nothing and left her trembling. "We're not going to the clinic," Ellie whispered. "We are," Ruth said. "But first we are going where no one can pretend they don't see." Wade drove fast, not reckless. That was the thing about him. Even at the edge of fury, he still handled danger like a man who knew one bad wheel or one wrong turn could kill the person he was trying to save. By the time the first buildings rose out of the morning haze, doors were opening. Smoke was lifting from chimneys. A man with a broom stopped in the middle of his porch and stared at the Mercer wagon coming in harder than ordinary business required. Then he saw Ellie's face. Then another person saw it. By the time Wade turned into Main Street, people were already stepping out from the mercantile, the barber shop, the feed store, the church walk. Tom rode in behind them with the deputy, trying to recover command before the crowd could form its own judgment. He cut across the wagon's path near the center of town. "That's far enough," he said. Wade hauled the horses up. The sudden jolt tore a cry out of Ellie before she could swallow it down. That changed the street more than any speech could have. There was no room left for rumor in the sound of that pain. Ruth stood in the wagon. "She needs a doctor." Tom answered loudly for the crowd now. "There is concern involving that child." "Then look at her," Ruth said. "Look close." Ellie tried to sit upright. For 1 second it seemed she might manage it. Then the pain took her full. Her body folded in on itself so violently that Ruth lunged too late to stop her from sliding off the seat board to the wagon floor. Wade dropped the reins and caught her shoulders before she struck the rail, but the child still crumpled in a tight, shaking knot at his knees. The whole street froze. Ruth climbed down and turned on the crowd. "You see her now," she said. No one answered. That was when a voice rose from near the mercantile door. "Doctor from the siding clinic is here," a store woman called. She came in on the dawn freight to see the rail foreman's hand. Ruth turned. A woman in a traveling coat stepped from the side passage with a black case in one hand and her sleeves already rolled back from the wrist. She had the look of someone interrupted in one hard duty and ready to start another without complaint. "Dr. June Avery." She crossed the street fast, took one look at Ellie in the wagon and said, "Move." People moved. Avery knelt in the dust and laid 2 fingers to Ellie's throat. Then she touched the left side of the child's belly through the blanket and looked up at Wade and Ruth. "How long?" "Months," Wade said. "Worse now," Ruth added. "I have notes." Avery held out her hand. Ruth gave her the paper packet and the board from the cellar. The doctor read quickly, her eyes moving from the scratched marks to Ruth's written list, then back to the child. She did not waste time pretending uncertain. Auntie, she did not feel. "Inside," she said. "Flat table, clean room if there is one." They took Ellie into the mercantile back room because it was nearest and empty. Wade went with them to the door, but Avery stopped him there with one firm look. "I need the woman with the notes," she said. He started to object. Ruth said, "Let her work." Inside, Avery examined Ellie with clean speed and no foolish language. She asked when the vomiting began, whether the swelling moved, whether it worsened after food, whether fever came with the pain. Ruth answered where she could. Ellie answered when she was able. The rest sat plain enough in the papers. At last, Avery straightened. "This is a growth," she said. "Large abdomen perhaps tied to the kidney or lower belly. I won't know until I open her, but I know enough already." Ruth felt the room narrow. Enough for what? Enough to say she needs surgery now. Ellie stared up at the doctor, white with pain and fear. "Am I bad?" Avery's face changed at once, not with pity, with anger at whoever had let the question reach a child this sick. "No," she said, "you are ill, that is all." Ellie began to cry then, not loudly, just the tired crying of someone who had held too much alone. Ruth brushed the hair from her forehead. "Hear that? Ill." Avery looked at Ruth. "The siding clinic is 2 miles east. I've got a table there and clean instruments. We move now." When Ruth stepped back into the street, Wade met her before she fully cleared the doorway. "Tell me." "It's a growth," Ruth said. "She needs surgery at once." Before he could answer, Avery came out behind her and faced the crowd. "This child has a medical emergency," she said, loud enough for the far porch to hear. "If anyone here means to stop her treatment, say so now in front of witnesses." No one spoke. Not Tom Baines, not the deputy, not the people who had leaned into rumor because it cost them nothing. They left town at once. The drive to the siding clinic felt longer than the road truly was. Ellie drifted in and out of sense. Ruth held the basin. Wade drove. Avery rode beside the rear wheel on a borrowed horse, one eye always on the wagon. At the clinic, everything narrowed to work. Boiled water, clean cloth, metal laid out on a tray. Avery gave the risk plain and did not waste words trying to make it smaller. "The child is weak," she said. "The growth is large. Delay has already cost her dearly." Wade listened to every sentence. He asked only one question. "If she wakes, will she know we were here?" "Yes," Avery said. That was enough. Before the ether cloth came down, Ellie looked first for Ruth, then for her father. Ruth took one hand, Wade took the other. "We're here," Ruth said. The child went under holding both truths. Waiting stripped the room bare. Wade sat once and stood again almost at once. He walked to the window and back, then to the door and back. The motion was worse than stillness, but Ruth did not tell him so. A man needs some labor when fear leaves him nothing useful to do. After a long while he said, "She asked if she was bad." Ruth nodded. He stared at the floor. "I should have seen what those notes were doing to her." "Yes," Ruth said. He took that without protest. Then a little later he added, "You saw it." Ruth did not answer. "You stayed with it," he said. "I did not." That was as close to confession as he could come. Hours later, Avery came out with tired shoulders and blood dried near one cuff. Wade crossed the room before the door had shut behind her. "She's alive," Avery said first. The air left Wade so hard he had to put one hand on the wall to steady himself. Avery went on. "It was a tumor, large and pressing hard enough to explain the swelling, the vomiting, and the pain after food. Another few weeks, perhaps less, and I doubt she would have survived winter." Truth at last, plain, solid, clean. When they brought Ellie back toward town the next afternoon, Avery told Wade not to slip past quietly. "If the lie was spoken in public," she said, "the truth can stand there too." So they stopped on Main Street. People gathered again, but differently now. Less hunger, more discomfort. Tom Baines came from the sheriff's office with the deputy behind him. Pike stood further back near the hitch rail, suddenly interested in the ground. Avery faced them all. "This child had an abdominal tumor," she said. "Not scandal, not misconduct. A tumor. She nearly died because treatment was delayed while suspicion was made to do the work of thought." No one answered. Avery's gaze found Tom. "You blocked a medical wagon." Tom tried to hold his chin up. "I acted on concern." "You acted on talk," Avery said, "and talk almost killed her." Then Wade spoke. He did not raise his voice. He did not need to. "My daughter was hurting where all of you could have seen it," he said. "Ruth Bell was the one who kept count, the one who pressed when others guessed, the one who stood between my child and every fool answer that came through my door." He turned his head slightly toward Ruth. "If Ellie lives to grow up, that woman is part of the reason." That settled more than the street wanted to admit. Tom looked as though he might answer. He did not. Pike stayed where he was and said nothing at all. Wade came to Ruth after the last of the watching fell quiet. "Come back with us," he said. She looked at him as hired help. He shook his head, as someone this house means to keep. There was no flourish in it, no softness added for show. That was why it mattered. Ruth looked once at the street, then at Ellie asleep beneath the blanket. "I'll answer at the ranch," she said. Wade nodded as if any other answer would have made him trust her less. He climbed up, gathered the reins, and turned the team toward home. This time, no one stepped into the road. The ranch grew quieter after they came back. Not empty quiet, settled quiet. The kind that comes when a house has spent too long bracing for the next blow and finally begins to believe the next hour might pass without one. Ellie spent the first days in bed, pale from surgery and weak from blood loss, but the hard strain had left her face. Pain still came, though smaller now and easier to speak. That was the first change. Instead of turning inward and fighting silence around it, she named it. It pulls when I move. Or it hurts on this side. Or sometimes only, not yet, give me a minute. Ruth answered each one as it came. All right. Then stay still a while longer. We'll try broth again later. No shame, no hiding, just the body telling the truth and someone hearing it. That alone began to change the house. The second change came with the old quilted apron. For the first few days, it stayed folded on the chair near Ellie's bed, not because she meant to wear it, but because children do not drop fear the same day they are told it is no longer needed. Then one morning Ruth came in with warm water and found the chair empty. The apron sat in a heap at the bottom of the wash basket. Ellie noticed Ruth looking at it. I don't want it back, she said. Ruth set the basin down. All right. The child picked at the blanket edge with careful fingers. Burn it if you want. Ruth studied her a moment. Do you? Ellie thought longer this time. Then she nodded. Ruth carried it outside that afternoon and fed it to the burn barrel in pieces, so the smoke would not billow black and thick enough to frighten the child from the window. Ellie watched from inside and did not look away. After that, she stopped reaching for the front of her dress every time she stood. Town behaved the way towns usually do after they have been made to face themselves. Unevenly, quietly, without the clean apology stories sometimes promise and real life rarely gives. A jar of broth came from the church kitchen with no note attached. A sack of apples was left on the porch rail one morning before sunup. When Wade went in for lamp oil, men in the feed store gave him room without trying to speak first. No one came to explain themselves. That made it feel more honest. Dr. Avery stopped by once on her way west with the freight crew. She checked Ellie's stitches, listened to the child's breathing, and told Wade what foods to hold back a while longer. At the door, she said to Ruth, "You kept better notes than some nurses I've trained." Ruth answered, "I only wrote down what was in front of me." Avery nodded. That is half of good work. Then she left as cleanly as she had entered, and Ruth was glad of it. Some people do what they must and do not stay behind to enjoy being right. Inside the house, Wade had begun changing too. Not in speeches, in habits. He started setting a second cup by Ruth's plate at breakfast without thinking about it. He brought the winter ledger to the kitchen table after supper and opened it near her elbow instead of carrying it back to the office room. He asked whether the root vegetables ought to stay in the cellar or be moved to the shed now that Ellie hated the sight of the door. Ruth answered each question plainly. Move the onions to the shed. Keep the potatoes cool. You need more soap before first freeze. Patch the south fence now, or you'll patch it twice in snow. He took the answers as if he expected them to matter. One evening, he set the pantry key on the table beside her cup. Ruth looked at it. What's this? "You run the kitchen," he said. "You ought to be able to lock it." That was all. But it was no small thing. A key means trust in a house where people have been counting and guarding for too long. Ellie noticed that change too. Children see structure before adults name it. She watched her father ask Ruth about stores, mending, winter orders, lamp oil, and chicken feed. She watched Ruth answer without shrinking or making herself small. Then late one cold evening, Ruth came out of the washroom with folded linens on her arm and stopped in the hall. Her trunk still sat near the pantry wall. Ray Wade had first told her to leave it. She had unpacked some. Aprons hung on pegs. 2 dresses lay in the drawer. But the trunk itself stayed latched, as if some part of her still expected the stay to end with one bad turn. Ellie stood in her doorway, thinner now, healing still, but straighter than before. "You didn't move it," she said. Ruth glanced at the trunk. "No." "Why?" Ruth considered the question. Old habits take their time. Ellie leaned one shoulder against the doorframe. "The little room isn't borrowed anymore." Ruth looked at her. The child went on, very serious. "It's yours if you want it." Simple words, clean words. They landed harder for that reason. Wade came in from the porch carrying split wood. He heard the last line and set the wood down by the stove without interrupting the moment. Then he crossed to the table and began laying out supper. 1 plate, then a second, then a third. He did it without looking up. No speech, no ceremony, just a man placing a fact in the middle of the room where everyone could see it. Ruth stood very still. Something in her chest eased that had been tight for longer than this week, longer than the county letter, maybe longer than the day her old life ended, and she had to learn how to ask the world for work instead of partnership. Ellie came slowly to the table and sat without one hand guarding her middle. Wade pulled out the 3rd chair. Ruth looked once at the trunk in the hall, then at the key by her cup, then at the 3rd plate. She sat down. No one said stay. They did not need to. The room had already said it. The next morning, Ruth opened her trunk. She did it in full daylight, with the pantry door wide and the kitchen fire already going. She folded her last 2 dresses into the drawer, set her sewing tin on the shelf, and laid her late husband's Bible beside the bed. Ellie stood in the doorway watching every move. Then she smiled, small but certain, and said, "Now it looks right." At supper, Wade brought the ranch ledger to the table and wrote 1 new line beneath the winter accounts. He turned the book so Ruth could see it. Housekeeper Ruth Bell, permanent. He did not make a speech after that. He only set the ledger down, broke the bread, and passed her the first piece like it belonged in her hand. Ellie reached across the table and touched Ruth's wrist. "You'll still be here when the snow comes?" she asked. Ruth looked at the child, then at Wade, then around the warm kitchen that no longer felt like borrowed shelter. "Yes," she said, "I will." Ellie let out a breath that sounded lighter than any Ruth had heard from her, and for the first time, she leaned back in her chair without guarding her middle. Outside, the wind moved over the pasture and against the barn wall, but inside the Mercer house nothing felt temporary anymore. The lamp burned steady. The 3rd plate stayed on the table. Ruth sat between the man who had learned to trust her and the child whose life she had helped save, and she understood at last that home was not the place that took you in when you were broken. It was the place that asked you to stay when you were strong enough to leave.